Ark Raiders is one of those games that keeps giving the more time you spend with it. And in this video, I have put together 157 things every player should know, covering the lore, the world design, the mechanics, the factions, and the secrets hiding in every corner of a surface world that most people never look at closely enough. I put this video together because Ark Raiders has a level of depth that does not announce itself loudly. When I started going through the lore fragments, the environmental details, the faction dialogue, and the item descriptions, I realized that most of what makes this game interesting is sitting in the background, waiting for someone to look at it. What you are watching now is the result of that looking. One specific choice I made when assembling this video was to lead with the world before I lead with the mechanics. I did that because I think the why of this world makes the how of it feel more meaningful. If you understand the people and the history, the moment-to-moment decisions in the game start to carry a weight they would not otherwise have. Before I move forward, I am counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. The World Before the Ark 1. The first thing worth understanding about Ark Raiders, before anything else, before the machines and the factions and the mechanics, is that this game takes place on Earth. Not a fictional planet with a different name, not a thinly disguised stand-in for our world, but Earth itself. This matters because it roots everything in a geography and a history that carries emotional weight. The cities are cities that existed. The people who built them were human. The architecture, the remnants of infrastructure, the specific quality of the landscape with its overcast northern European light and its cold, patient sky, all of it belongs to a recognizable world that was lost rather than a fantasy world that was never real. That grounding is one of the first and most important design choices the game makes, and it informs how every other element of the lore should be understood. 2. The world of Ark Raiders. Before the invasion was not a paradise. This is an important early lore point that is easy to miss because the game does not dwell on it. The evidence scattered across the surface world, in pre-invasion materials, in the architectural decisions of certain structures, in the residue of certain institutions, suggests a civilization that was already under meaningful pressure when the Ark arrived. Energy systems were strained. Political structures were unstable in ways that were beginning to show. Certain kinds of international cooperation were fracturing under the weight of competing interests. The world was not a stable, flourishing place that was simply interrupted by catastrophe. It was a world already dealing with its own difficulties, and the Ark added to those difficulties in a way that turned a challenging situation into an unsurvivable one. 3. One of the more interesting structural details about the pre-invasion world is the technology level. Ark Raiders places its world at a point of technological development that is somewhat ahead of where most players are sitting now. Sophisticated automation was common. Modular construction systems had reached a level of development that made the building of large, complex structures more accessible than it had been. Materials science had advanced enough that certain types of construction that would be expensive and time-consuming in our world were relatively routine in theirs. You can read this in the bones of the ruins that cover the surface. These were not primitive buildings. They were the products of a technically sophisticated civilization, and the level of their decay tells you that it has been a long time since anyone maintained them. 4. The geography of the surface world in Ark Raiders is worth spending time with as a lore element because it is specific in ways that matter. The climate is Northern European in character. The architecture reflects a building tradition that is distinct and recognizable. The quality of light, the type of vegetation that has reclaimed the ruins, the specific character of the soil and the sky, all of these details place the game in a real part of the world rather than in a generic post-apocalyptic landscape. That geographic specificity tells you something about what communities are working with when they send raiders to the surface. The environment has particular challenges and particular resources that are determined by where it is on Earth. 5. The question of how long ago the invasion actually happened is one that new players often do not think carefully about, but that experienced lore readers treat as a foundational question. The game does not state the timeline directly. You have to infer it from the environmental evidence, the level of structural decay in surface ruins, the depth and character of vegetation reclamation in different zones, the degree to which certain materials have weathered beyond usefulness, the extent to which communities underground have developed social and cultural depth. All of these pieces of evidence, taken together, point toward an invasion that happened not years ago, but decades. These communities have been underground for a long time. The people alive today inherited the aftermath of something that happened before most of them were born. 6. The underground settlements that players encounter in Ark Raiders are one of the most important and most underappreciated elements of the world's lore. These are not emergency shelters full of frightened recent refugees. They are communities that have had decades to develop their own culture, their own social structures, their own economies, their own ways of understanding the world, and their place in it. When you interact with the various vendors and faction representatives and quest givers in the game, you are not talking to people who are in shock. You are talking to people who have built lives in these places, who were probably born in these places, who know no other home, and who relate to the underground with something closer to ownership than displacement. That is a fundamentally different emotional and social situation from what most post-apocalyptic games imagine. 7. The name that humans gave to the invading machines, the Ark, is a lore detail that rewards attention. It was not a name that the machines provided for themselves. It is a name that humans assigned, and the most supported interpretation of why is the one that connects it to the trajectory these objects followed when they arrived. An arc is a curved path through space. The machines came from somewhere above Earth, and they followed arcing paths as they descended, and at some point, in the chaos of those early days, that word became the word. This is consistent with how humans have always named the things that threaten them. You name the threat after the most memorable feature of the moment you first encountered it, and the arc of their arrival was something that witnesses clearly found defining. 8. The social reality of the underground communities is one of the game's most quietly interesting lore subjects. These communities are not internally peaceful or perfectly organized. They are human communities, which means they have all the internal tensions and competing interests and occasional failures of collective organization that characterize human communities everywhere. What makes them different is the particular set of pressures those tensions operate under. Resource scarcity, the constant shadow of external threat, the psychological weight of a confined existence. All of these create a social pressure cooker that has shaped the culture of these communities in ways that are specific to their situation and that you can read in the faction dynamics and the social structures that players encounter. 9. One of the lore details that most players skip past is the relationship between the underground settlements and the pre-invasion structures they are built within or adjacent to. Many of the underground spaces that communities inhabit were not built specifically as post-invasion shelters. They were pre-invasion infrastructure of various kinds, tunnels, bunkers, industrial underground spaces that were adapted and expanded as the invasion made surface life impossible. The specific character of each community's underground space is partly a function of what pre-invasion structure they built on. A community that settled in a pre-invasion industrial facility has different spatial possibilities and different resource starting points than one that settled in a simple civil defense shelter. 10. The economic system that has developed in the underground communities is worth understanding as a lore element, even for players who primarily care about the game's mechanics. The economy is built around scarcity, and the scarcity is organized around specific resource types that the underground cannot produce internally and must obtain from the surface. This is not an abstract economic arrangement. It is the fundamental driver of the relationship between the underground communities and the surface world, and therefore the fundamental driver of the existence of raiders as a social and occupational category. The economy explains why raiders exist and why the communities care about them. Remove the economic need and the entire social structure of the game dissolves. 11. There is a class dynamic in the world of Ark Raiders that is subtle enough to miss on first read, but that becomes clearer with attention. Not everyone in the underground world has the same social position or the same relationship to the risks of surface life. Most people in the underground communities never go to the surface at all. They live their lives performing whatever functions keep the community running, and they are entirely dependent on raiders for the surface-sourced resources that those functions require. This dependence creates a complex social relationship between raiders and the broader community. Raiders have leverage, they have status, they also have dramatically shorter life expectancies than the people who depend on them, and the social management of that asymmetry is one of the more interesting dynamics in the underground world. 12. The faction structure that players encounter in Ark Raiders is not incidental to the lore. It is an expression of something real about how human communities organize themselves under pressure. When survival requires both resource acquisition and defense and research and social organization, and when resources are too constrained to do all of these things equally well, different groups form around different priorities. The factions in Ark Raiders represent different answers to the question of what matters most when you cannot do everything. Understanding what each faction is actually arguing for, not just what they offer mechanically, but what their existence represents in terms of the world's social history, gives the faction system a depth that it otherwise lacks. 13. The relationship between the surface world and the underground world is not simply one of danger versus safety. The surface is dangerous, yes, but it is also the source of everything the underground communities need to survive. The underground is safer, but it is not self-sufficient. This creates a relationship between the two spaces that is characterized by dependency rather than simple opposition. The underground communities need the surface in a profound way, even as they fear it. And the raiders who bridge those two spaces are the physical embodiment of that dependency, people whose entire identity is built around the movement between a world of relative safety and a world of mortal risk. 14. One of the more philosophically interesting aspects of the lore is the question of what the communities remember about the pre-invasion world and how accurately they remember it. The oldest members of the underground communities were children during the invasion. Their memories of the surface world, as it was, are fragmentary, emotional, and shaped by decades of underground life, during which those memories have been revisited countless times in the context of loss. The people born underground have no experiential memory of the surface at all. What they know about the pre-invasion world is mediated entirely through the accounts of their elders and through whatever records the communities have managed to preserve. That mediation shapes the relationship of underground communities with the idea of the surface world in ways that are both predictable and interesting. 15. The preserved knowledge of the pre-invasion world that the underground communities maintain is one of their most important assets, and the way it has been preserved is one of the more interesting lore details available. Some of it exists in written form, in books and technical manuals, and records that communities manage to bring underground, or that raiders have retrieved from the surface. Some of it exists in the institutional memory of specific individuals, the people who had certain technical knowledge before the invasion and who have spent decades passing it on. Some of it has been lost in the gaps between these two forms of preservation. The knowledge that exists now is not the same as the knowledge that existed before, and the specific gaps in the record have shaped community development in ways that are visible if you know where to look. 16. The architecture of the surface ruins is, if you approach it with the right kind of attention, one of the richest lore documents in the game. Buildings communicate their history through the specific ways they have aged and deteriorated. The pattern of structural failure in any given building tells you something about its construction, its materials, its relationship to the surrounding environment, and the specific forces that have acted on it over time. Machine activity leaves different marks than simple weathering. Human activity leaves different marks than both. An observer who knows how to read these physical traces can reconstruct quite a lot of the specific history of any given surface location, and the game rewards this kind of close environmental reading with layers of detail that a less attentive player will simply walk past. 17. The pre-invasion cultural material that players find on the surface is one of the most emotionally resonant elements of the game's environmental storytelling. Books left on shelves, photographs on walls, children's toys in corners, domestic objects arranged in patterns that speak to the routines of lives that were interrupted mid-sentence. These things are not labelled or explained. The game trusts you to understand what it means to find a child's drawing on a refrigerator in a kitchen that has been empty for 30 years. That trust, that refusal to explain what the environment is communicating, is one of the more sophisticated choices in the game's design, and it is the source of a great deal of the game's emotional texture. 18. The question of what the world's governments and military organizations did in the face of the invasion is one that the lore addresses only obliquely, through the evidence of their failure rather than through any direct account of their attempts. The surface world shows the traces of defensive preparation, abandoned positions, the remnants of equipment that was deployed and did not work well enough. The underground communities show no trace of formal government as a functioning institution. From these two data points, you can infer quite a lot about what the organised response to the invasion was like. There was probably enormous effort and enormous sacrifice, and ultimately insufficient result. What remains of all that effort now is the physical evidence on the surface and the practical knowledge of failure that has shaped how the underground communities organised themselves. 19. One of the things that the game's world building does with particular care is the representation of time. The surface world of Ark Raiders is not simply a world in which bad things happened. It is a world in which bad things happened a long time ago, and the world has been living with the consequences ever since. The particular quality of long-elapsed catastrophe is difficult to render in any medium, and Ark Raiders manages it through the combination of deep decay with active ecological recovery, through the specific character of community culture that has had decades to develop, through the generational distance between living people and the events that shaped their world. Time is built into the fabric of the surface world and the underground communities in ways that feel earned. 20. The first chapter of understanding Ark Raiders, as I have argued it, is really the chapter of understanding what this world was before it became what it is, and how the long process of living with catastrophe has shaped what it has become. The specific character of the pre-invasion world, the specific timeline and nature of the invasion, the specific way that communities have developed in its aftermath, all of these are foundational to understanding everything else the game presents. With this foundation in place, the machines and the factions and the surface world and the mechanics of Raider life all sit within a context that gives them meaning beyond their immediate function. And that meaning is ultimately what makes the world of Ark Raiders worth spending time in. 21. One of the details about underground community life that is easy to pass over, but that becomes more interesting the more you think about it, is the management of artificial light. Natural light cycles are one of the fundamental organisers of human biological rhythm, and underground communities have none. The artificial light systems that keep the settlements from being in perpetual darkness, are critical infrastructure that requires energy, maintenance, and careful management. The quality and availability of light in different parts of the settlement is probably a social marker of sorts, with the most important community spaces getting the best light and the least important getting what is left over. This seemingly small detail has implications for the daily experience of underground life that are worth considering. 22. The relationship between different underground communities, the diplomatic and economic ties that connect them, is one of the most important and least visible aspects of the game's world. Individual settlements are not self-sufficient. They depend on networks of exchange with other settlements for materials, for information, for medical knowledge, for the genetic diversity that prevents the problems that come with closed populations over generations. These inter-settlement networks are the infrastructure of the broader human survival effort, and they are maintained through the work of traders and diplomats and raiders who operate between settlements as well as between underground and surface. The factions in the game are partly expressions of these inter-settlement networks, representing interests that extend beyond any single community. 23. The concept of community memory in the underground settlements is one that has both practical and cultural dimensions that are worth separating and examining individually. On the practical dimension, community memory includes the accumulated knowledge of surface conditions, machine behavior patterns, resource locations, and the technical knowledge required to maintain the settlement's infrastructure. This practical memory is survival critical, and the communities treat its preservation accordingly. On the cultural dimension, community memory includes the stories of the invasion, the histories of community founding and development, the accounts of significant raiders and leaders and events. This cultural memory is what gives the community a sense of its own identity and continuity across generations. 24. The raiders themselves, before getting into any detail about what they do and how they do it, are worth understanding as a social category with a specific relationship to the broader underground community. They are not simply brave or reckless individuals who happen to be good at surface survival. They are the product of a specific community need, trained and equipped at community expense, operating within a social framework that defines their role and its obligations. The Raider is a community institution, not just a personal choice. Understanding that institutional character is key to understanding the social dynamics that shape Raider culture and the specific pressures that Raiders operate under both on the surface and when they return underground. 25. One of the things the game suggests through its design, without ever stating directly, is that the underground communities have developed particular customs around death. People die in these communities at rates that are higher than any pre-invasion community would have found acceptable. Because raiders are a large percentage of the adult working population, and raiders have high mortality. The customs that allow communities to process this ongoing loss, to grieve without being paralyzed, to maintain the social bonds that give communities their coherence, even as individual members of those bonds are regularly lost, are part of the cultural life of the underground that the game implies without displaying. These customs are some of the most human things about this world. 26. The question of religion in the underground communities is one the lore leaves open in interesting ways. Human communities in extremis have historically reached for various systems of meaning to make sense of their situation and to provide psychological frameworks for living with danger and loss. The underground communities of Ark Raiders would presumably have developed their own such systems, some adapted from pre-invasion belief traditions and others newly formed in response to the specific experience of the invasion and the underground life that followed it. Whether any of these systems engage directly with the Ark itself Whether the machines have become part of any community's symbolic or theological framework is a question the game does not answer but seems designed to invite. 27. The particular psychology of people who have spent their entire lives underground is a lore element that the game implies through social dynamics, rather than stating through direct exposition. People who have never experienced open sky, who have grown up in enclosed spaces with artificial light and controlled air, who have learned the world through stories of a surface they have never seen, would have a relationship to space and to outdoor environments that is fundamentally different from the relationship of people who grew up in them. The concept of agoraphobia has its underground equivalent in the form of people who experience the concept of the surface world with a kind of abstract vertigo, who understand it intellectually, but for whom it does not feel real in the experiential sense. 28. The engineering culture of the underground communities is one of the most practically impressive aspects of the world. These communities have maintained power generation, water purification, food production, air circulation, waste management, and manufacturing capacity in subterranean environments for decades, with limited access to the surface for replacement components and repair materials. The specific engineering solutions they have developed for these challenges are not documented in any single place in the game, but they are implied by the existence of functioning settlements. What those solutions look like in detail, how they have evolved over time, what their failure modes are, and how communities manage those failures, is a rich area of implied lore that the game builds context for without fully populating. 29. The food systems of the underground communities deserve specific attention as a lore element because they represent some of the most technically challenging adaptation that the communities have had to make. Agriculture, as it existed in the pre-invasion world, is not possible underground. The communities have had to develop alternative approaches to food production that do not require sunlight or large open spaces. Hydroponic systems, fungal cultivation, insect protein production. These are the kinds of solutions that the logistics of underground food production point toward. The specific character of the diet in underground communities is shaped by what can be produced and what can be salvaged from the surface, and it is very different from the diet of the pre-invasion world. 30. The children of the underground communities are born into a world that is comprehensible to them, but that would be almost unrecognizable to someone from the pre-invasion world. They grow up knowing the particular rhythms of underground life, the specific social dynamics of their settlement, the particular sensory environment of enclosed spaces with artificial light. Their frame of reference for normalcy is entirely defined by underground existence. The surface world for them is not a lost home, but a dangerous externality, a place from which things come that they need, and in which people go and sometimes do not return. This relationship with the surface is one of the more interesting aspects of generational change in the underground communities. 31. One of the more quietly significant details about the underground communities is the management of their genetic diversity. Small populations in isolated environments are subject to the problems that come with inbreeding over generations, and communities that have been underground for decades, with limited genetic exchange with other communities, will be beginning to experience these pressures. The intersettlement networks that the game implies are partly a response to this genetic reality. Trade in resources is also, at a biological level, trade in genetic material through the movement of people between settlements. The communities that have managed this aspect of long-term survival well are probably doing better than the ones that have not paid attention to it. 32. The social role of older raiders, those who have survived long enough to be past their most productive surface operation years, is a lore question that the game implies without answering directly. What happens to a raider who can no longer operate effectively on the surface? They carry knowledge and experience that is enormously valuable to the community, knowledge that was earned through years of dangerous work, and that cannot be replicated through any other means. The ideal outcome is that this knowledge is transmitted to the next generation through formal instruction or informal mentorship. In practice, the transmission of tacit knowledge, the kind that lives in the body rather than in words, is always incomplete. Some of what the most experienced raiders know dies with them. 33. The materials culture of the underground settlements, the specific set of materials that are available and how they are used, is one of the more interesting areas of implied lore in the game. Underground communities cannot access the full range of materials that the pre-invasion world produced. They work with what they can salvage from the surface and what they can manufacture with the resources they have. This constraint has shaped the aesthetic and functional character of underground-made objects in ways that are visible in the equipment and environment that players encounter. Things are functional rather than decorative, modular rather than specialized, repairable rather than disposable. The material culture of the underground reflects the constraints of underground production. 34. The concept of what it means to be an elder in the underground communities is different from what it meant in the pre-invasion world. In a world where most adults who go to the surface face elevated mortality risk, surviving into older age is itself a form of accomplishment that carries social meaning. But the elderhood of the underground is also a specific form of knowledge holding. The oldest community members are the ones who have the most complete memory of the invasion and its immediate aftermath, the most complete set of practical knowledge about surface conditions and machine behavior developed over long careers, the most complete picture of community history. Their knowledge is irreplaceable, and communities that have invested in capturing and transmitting that knowledge are better positioned than those that have not. 35. The underground communities have developed their own aesthetic traditions that are specific to their situation and that would be alien to someone from the pre-invasion world. Art made with available materials rather than specialized ones. Music adapted to the acoustic environment of enclosed spaces. Storytelling that has developed particular traditions around specific themes. The invasion, the first years underground, the founding of the settlement, the notable raiders, and events of community history. These aesthetic traditions are the cultural expression of a community that has built something new out of the wreckage of what was, and they are worth taking seriously as evidence of the underground community's genuine cultural depth. 36. The experience of dreaming in the underground communities is probably shaped by the specific sensory environment of underground life in ways that would be interesting to trace. People who have never seen an open sky would presumably not dream of it in the way that people who remember it do. The dreams of the oldest underground residents might be haunted by surface memories, by the specific quality of outdoor light and open air that they remember from childhood. The dreams of those born underground would presumably reflect their actual sensory experience, the specific textures and light conditions and sounds of the world they know. These different dream lives are one of the more intimate expressions of the generational divide within underground communities. 37. The political structures of the underground communities are by necessity more concentrated and more authority-conscious than anything in the pre-invasion world's democratic tradition would have found comfortable. When resources are critically constrained and the wrong decision can cost lives, the social pressure towards centralized decision-making is strong. The communities that have managed to maintain some degree of distributed decision-making and individual autonomy, alongside the centralization that survival requires, are probably the most resilient over the long term, because they have avoided the brittle fragility that comes with too much concentration of authority in too few individuals. But achieving that balance under the pressure of constant threat is not easy. 38. The relationship between underground communities and the concept of privacy is one that the spatial reality of underground life has transformed in significant ways. In a small enclosed community where most social and work life is communal and space is at a premium, the privacy norms of the pre-invasion world are simply not sustainable. Communities have developed different norms around privacy that are more permissive about shared space and shared life, and more focused on protecting specific domains of individual experience that communities have determined are important to individual dignity. The specific shape of these norms varies between settlements and is one of the markers of each settlement's particular culture. 39. The concept of childhood in the underground communities is worth examining because it differs from the pre-invasion concept in ways that are significant. Children are a community resource in a way that they were not in the pre-invasion world, or at least not as explicitly. They represent the future labour force, the future raiders, the future maintainers of community systems. This practical relationship between community and children coexists with the genuine love and care that parents and community members feel for children as individuals. Managing this tension between the child as a community asset and the child as an individual with their own developing inner life is one of the more complex ethical challenges of underground community life. 40. The final thought of the first chapter is this: the world that the underground communities have built is real. It has depth and texture and history and contradictions. It has beauty and ugliness and moments of genuine human connection, alongside moments of pragmatic cruelty. It is not a simplified version of a human world. It is a human world operating under specific and extraordinary constraints, and it has produced something that is unmistakably human in its complexity. When you play Ark Raiders, you are not playing a game set in a backdrop. You are playing a game set in a world. And that distinction makes a difference to how every element of the game should be understood. 41. The communities have been shaped by the invasion in ways that go all the way down to their emotional cultures. The pre-invasion world presumably had the full range of human emotional expression, including the luxury of extended grief, extended celebration, extended periods of low-stakes emotional engagement. The underground communities have compressed emotional processing out of necessity. Grief is real, but it is managed, contained, moved through more quickly than the pre-invasion world's norms would have considered healthy, because the community cannot afford to have significant portions of its working population in extended non-functional grief states. This compression of emotional processing is both a strength and a cost. 42. The intergenerational tensions within underground communities are one of the most interesting social dynamics the law implies. Older community members who remember the pre-invasion world carry a certain authority based on that memory, on the fact that they know what was lost in a way that those born underground cannot. But they also carry a set of assumptions and expectations formed in a world that no longer exists, and these assumptions sometimes come into conflict with the practical needs of the underground world as it actually is. The younger generations, formed entirely by underground reality, sometimes chafe at norms and practices that made sense in the pre-invasion world, but that have limited application in the underground. 43. The concept of expertise in the underground communities has been substantially reorganized by the conditions of underground life. Pre-invasion expertise hierarchies were shaped by a much wider range of economic and social needs. The underground world has simplified the range of expertise that matters into a narrower set defined by survival requirements. The most valued experts are those who can maintain critical systems, who have medical knowledge, who understand the surface world and its threats, who can make and repair equipment. The expertise that was valuable in the pre-invasion world but that has no survival application underground has mostly been lost, because the communities cannot afford to invest resources in maintaining knowledge that does not contribute to their ability to persist. 44. One of the things that is easy to forget about the underground communities is that they have been largely cut off from each other, as well as from the surface world. The isolation of individual settlements, the difficulty of maintaining contact across the distances and dangers of the surface world has meant that different communities have developed independently of each other in significant ways. Cultural practices have diverged. Technical solutions have evolved differently. Social norms have been shaped by the specific experiences and pressures of each individual settlement. The communities that encounter each other through trading networks and raider interaction are not meeting mirror images of themselves. They are meeting genuinely different human communities that have reached their current state through decades of separate development. 45. The question of what constitutes waste in the underground communities is entirely different from what constituted waste in the pre-invasion world. In a world of relative material abundance, many things that have reached the end of their primary function are simply discarded. In the underground communities, nothing that can be repurposed or cannibalized for components is wasted. The material efficiency of underground communities is not an ideological commitment. It is a survival necessity, and this material culture, this orientation toward extracting value from everything through its entire possible useful life, has shaped the aesthetic and practical character of underground-made objects in ways that are consistently visible in the game's design. 46. The recreational life of underground communities is one of the more humanizing aspects of the world that the game implies without developing in detail. Even under extreme resource constraints and constant existential pressure, humans maintain forms of play and leisure and social enjoyment. The specific character of recreation in the underground communities would be shaped by the materials available, the space constraints of underground life, the particular social dynamics of small enclosed communities, and the specific things that underground residents need relief from. Games that require no equipment, stories, music, physical activity in whatever space is available. These are the forms of recreation that survive the material constraints of underground life. 47. The relationship between underground communities and the concept of beauty is one that the lore touches on indirectly through the aesthetic character of the settlements and the artifacts that players encounter. Beauty has not been abandoned in the underground communities. It has been redefined. The specific forms it takes, the underground-specific aesthetic traditions of art made with available materials in enclosed spaces, reflect a community's insistence on maintaining some relationship with the human capacity for aesthetic experience, even when that experience has to be generated under constraint. This insistence is itself a form of resistance to the dehumanizing conditions of the occupation. 48. The concept of hope in the underground communities is one that has been refined by the experience of long occupation into something different from the more expansive hope that characterizes communities in less constrained circumstances. Underground hope is practical. It focuses on achievable, near-term goals rather than on the sweeping transformation of the overall situation. It is the hope of getting through this season, of getting the medical supplies that the community needs, of bringing back the components to repair the water system. This smaller-scale hope is more sustainable under the conditions of underground life than a hope organized around large-scale change, because it offers the possibility of actual fulfillment rather than the perpetual deferral of an always distant goal. 49. The specific ways in which underground communities have adapted pre-invasion cultural practices to their current situation are some of the more interesting lore details available. Pre-invasion cultural practices, holidays, ceremonies, social rituals have not been abandoned in the underground communities. They have been modified, adapted, stripped of their pre-invasion context and given new meaning, shaped by underground experience. A ceremony that was originally about the harvest in the pre-invasion world might now be about the successful return of a raider team. A pre-invasion holiday might have been given new meaning in terms of community founding or a significant moment in community history. This adaptation of cultural tradition is one of the ways communities maintain continuity with the past while building relevance in the present. 50. The world before the Ark ended did not simply die when the invasion came, it transformed. The buildings are still standing, the streets are still there, the records still exist in fragments, in the memories of elders, in the objects that raiders bring back from the surface. The pre-invasion world is present in the underground communities as a ghost, as a context that shapes how they understand themselves and where they came from. And the relationship between that ghost and the living community is one of the most interesting, ongoing tensions in the world of Ark Raiders. The communities are neither simply preserving the pre-invasion world, nor simply abandoning it. They are in an ongoing negotiation with it, trying to figure out what is worth keeping and what belongs to a world that is gone. Chapter 2. Understanding the Ark Threat 51. The Ark as an entity or as a system is one of the most thoughtfully constructed antagonistic forces in recent games precisely because it refuses to be simple. The machines do not hate humanity. There is no evidence anywhere in the available lore that anything resembling malice or hostility drives their operations. They are pursuing some kind of purpose, following some kind of programming or intention, and that purpose has brought them to Earth. And the execution of that purpose is incompatible with human surface habitation. But incompatibility is not the same as malice. The machines are not trying to hurt people in any meaningful sense of the word trying. They are doing something, and people are in the way of it. That distinction is subtle but important, and it shapes everything about how the Ark threat should be understood. 52. The physical variety of Ark machines that players encounter on the surface is one of the first details that rewards attention from a lore perspective. There is not a single machine type that does everything. There is a range of forms, from smaller, faster, more numerous units to larger, slower, more powerful ones. This variety is not arbitrary. It reflects a design philosophy that values functional specialization. Different machines built for different operational roles within a coordinated system. The smaller units might serve functions of patrol and initial response. The larger units might serve functions of heavy response or infrastructure protection. Reading the machine types as a functional system, rather than as a collection of individual enemies, is one of the ways that experienced raiders and engaged lore readers make sense of the surface world's machine ecology. 53. The movement and patrol behavior of Ark machines is one of the most evidentially significant aspects of their design for lore purposes. They do not wander randomly. They move with purpose, following routes that cover specific territories, responding to detected intrusion in ways that are organized rather than chaotic. Smaller units respond in ways that are consistent with alerting a larger system to the intrusion. Larger units respond in ways that are consistent with addressing a threat that has been escalated through the system. The consistency of this behavior pattern across different areas and different circumstances suggests a coordination system that extends beyond individual machine capability. Something is organizing these machines, and understanding what that something is would tell you a great deal about what the Ark actually is. 54. One of the most interesting behavioral features of Ark machines, from a lore perspective, is the variation in their response intensity, depending on where on the surface the intrusion occurs. Not every area receives the same level of machine attention. Some areas are patrolled heavily and consistently. Others see much less machine activity. This variation is not random. It appears to correlate with the proximity of certain surface features, the structures and installations that the Ark has built or modified, the areas where whatever the Ark is doing on the surface is most concentrated. The machines are not uniformly spread across the surface. They're concentrated around what matters to the Ark, and mapping those concentrations is a way of mapping Ark priorities. 55. The question of Ark machines' self-repair is one that has significant practical and law implications. Machines that have been damaged in encounters with raiders sometimes appear to retreat rather than fight to destruction. This retreat behavior is consistent with self-preservation, with a system that has been designed to maintain its own operational integrity rather than to fight to the last regardless of condition. If the machines can self-repair, then the destruction of machines in any given encounter has a different strategic meaning than it would if machines were simply destroyed and not replaced. The long-term attrition rate of the machine population on the surface is one of the strategic variables that underground communities would care deeply about if they had any hope of eventually challenging Ark control of the surface. 56. The sensory systems of Ark machines are a subject that experienced raiders develop a practical understanding of through-field experience, and that law readers find interesting for what they imply about the Ark's design philosophy. Different machine types appear to have different primary sensing modalities. Some seem primarily visual, others seem more responsive to sound or to heat, or to electromagnetic signals. This diversity of sensing modalities across machine types is consistent with a design philosophy that values redundancy and the covering of potential detection gaps. Building machines with different sensor types means that a human attempting to evade detection by addressing one type of sensing still faces detection from other types. This approach to sensor design suggests a sophisticated understanding of how intelligent threats attempt to evade detection. 57. The way Ark machines handle the presence of other machine units, the apparent communication and coordination between units, is one of the aspects of machine behavior that most clearly suggests a distributed intelligence rather than simple individual programming. Units that individually encounter a raider behave in ways that allow other units to join the response. The response to a raider team is more than the simple sum of individual unit responses. It is a coordinated behavioral adaptation to the specific situation. Whether this coordination happens through direct machine-to-machine communication, through some kind of shared network, or through some other mechanism is not clear from the available evidence. But the coordination itself is evident, and it is one of the things that makes surface operations so challenging. 58. The physical construction of Ark machines, as implied by their external appearance and by what can be learned through salvaging their components, tells you something about the engineering philosophy that produced them. They are built to be functional rather than impressive. Their forms are determined by their operational requirements rather than by any aesthetic consideration. There is no excess material, no ornamentation, nothing that does not serve a specific function. This design philosophy of pure functional optimization is itself a form of information about whatever intelligence created these machines. It is an intelligence that is not interested in display or symbolism, that evaluates its creations purely on operational effectiveness. 59. The question of whether Ark machines are capable of anything analogous to learning is one of the more interesting unresolved questions in the law community. Raiders who have operated in the same areas over extended periods have reported that machine responses to established tactics sometimes seem to change, that approaches that were effective early in a raider's career become less reliable over time. This could be explained by simple observer bias, or by changes in the raider's own behavior that affect machine responses without the raider fully tracking those changes. But it could also reflect genuine behavioral adaptation by the machine system, a capacity to modify responses based on accumulated experience. If the machines are learning, then human tactical knowledge is in a permanent arms race, with a system that is continuously studying what humans do. 60. The Ark machine's apparent relationship with the underground communities is one of the most significant and most puzzling aspects of their behavior. The machines know, or should be able to know, based on their apparent sensory and analytical capabilities, that human communities exist underground. The surface access points are not perfectly concealed. The evidence of raider activity on the surface points clearly toward organized human habitation nearby, and yet the machines do not appear to have made the systematic location and destruction of underground communities a primary operational priority. They respond aggressively to raider incursions on the surface, but they do not pursue raiders back through access points into the underground. The reason for this restraint, whether it reflects a machine priority system that ranks surface operations above destroying underground communities or some other factor, is one of the law questions that has the most significant practical implications for the survival of those communities. 61. The Ark's relationship with the physical environment of Earth is something that plays out in observable ways on the surface, if you know what to look at. The machines alter the environments they operate in. Certain areas show evidence of physical modification that cannot be explained by simple machine operational activity. Ground is rearranged, structures are modified, certain materials are concentrated in specific areas. These modifications are evidence of something the Ark is actively doing to the surface of Earth beyond simply occupying it and defending against human intrusion. What that something is, what the specific environmental modification is working toward, is one of the central law mysteries that the game presents through its environment rather than through any explicit explanation. 62. One of the more unsettling implications of the Ark machine behavioral data is that the machines appear to be patient in a way that biological intelligence typically is not. Human planning operates on timescales of years or decades at most. The machines have been on Earth for decades without any apparent urgency, pursuing their surface activities without the kind of pressure or deadline consciousness that would characterize a project with defined near-term goals. This patience is either the result of a plan that operates on very long timescales, a project that will take centuries rather than years to complete, or it is the result of a fundamentally different relationship with time than biological intelligence has. Either interpretation is significant and somewhat troubling. 63. The energy requirements of Ark machine operations are something that the law points toward through the observable behavior of machines and their apparent operational stamina. These machines have been running on the surface for decades without apparent depletion of operational capacity. Their energy systems must therefore be either extremely efficient or self-replenishing in some way that does not require external supply. The question of how Ark machines power themselves is a practical one for raiders who might be interested in disrupting machine operations, and a law one for anyone trying to understand the Ark as a system. If the machines can draw energy from the environment around them, that changes the strategic calculus of human resistance in significant ways. 64. There is a theory in the law community that the Ark machines on Earth are not self-contained but are connected to some larger infrastructure, possibly in orbit or beyond. This connection, if it exists, could explain the apparent coordination of machine behavior across large areas of the surface world without any visible central coordination point. It could also explain how the machines maintain awareness of the overall strategic situation without any centralized surface headquarters that humans have been able to identify. If the machines are networked to an off-planet infrastructure, then surface-based interference with that network might be possible, though the implications of what would happen if that network were disrupted are uncertain. 65. The Ark machine's approach to human-built technology is a law detail that is revealing. They do not appear to be interested in human technology for its own sake. They interact with human-built infrastructure primarily when it is in the way of or represents a threat to their operations. The ruins of the pre-invasion world, standing empty for decades, have not been systematically demolished by machine activity, except in areas where they interfere with whatever the machines are doing. This disinterest in human technology suggests that whatever the machines were built for, it does not require understanding or capturing human technological capability. They were not sent to Earth to learn from us or to use what we built. They were sent for some other reason, and human technology is incidental to it. 66. The interaction between Ark machines and the ecological life of the surface world is one of the subtler law elements available to careful observers. Animals have developed behavioral patterns around machine presence over generations of exposure. Prey animals avoid areas of heavy machine activity with a consistency that suggests learned predator avoidance behavior that has been reinforced over decades. The fact that this behavioral adaptation exists at all tells you something important about the timeline of the Ark's presence. You need multiple generations of animal learning for this kind of behavioral pattern to become established in a population. The surface ecology's relationship with the machines is, in its own way, a dating technique for the invasion. 67. One of the more philosophically interesting aspects of the Ark threat from a law perspective is the question of what the Ark's success would look like. What is the Ark trying to achieve? When would the machine's program consider itself complete? If the answer is something like resource extraction, then there might be an endpoint at which extraction is complete, and the machines depart, leaving a damaged but potentially recoverable surface. If the answer is something more like permanent transformation of the surface environment, then there may be no endpoint at which the machines voluntarily leave. Understanding the Ark's ultimate goal is the prerequisite for any meaningful long-term human strategy for dealing with it. 68. The Ark machine's apparent lack of interest in communicating with humanity is itself a significant data point. In most scenarios where a technologically superior entity encounters a less technologically advanced one, some form of communication occurs, even if only to assert dominance or state demands. The Ark machines have made no such communication, or at least none that has been recognized as such. Either they are incapable of human-scale communication, or they have no interest in communicating with humans, or they have communicated in ways that humans have not recognized as communication. Each of these possibilities implies something different about the Ark's relationship with human intelligence and with the question of whether humans are significant to the Ark at all. 69. The specific areas of the surface world that are most heavily defended by Ark machines are, if the law interpretation is correct, the areas where the Ark's primary purpose on Earth is most actively being pursued. Identifying these areas and understanding what they have in common is one of the ways that the law community has tried to develop theories about Ark purpose. The patterns that emerge from this analysis suggest that the machines are concentrating their activity around specific types of pre-invasion human infrastructure, which is interesting because it implies that whatever the Ark is doing on Earth requires or benefits from proximity to specific things that humans built. That implication opens a set of questions about the relationship between Ark purpose and pre-invasion human activity that the law does not resolve. 70. The concept of Ark machine hierarchy. The idea that there may be some units that serve coordination or command functions relative to other units is one that the game's design implies through the behavioral dynamics of machine encounters without making it explicit in any law document. Certain machine types do seem to trigger escalated responses from surrounding machines when damaged or destroyed in ways that other machine types do not. Whether this reflects a true command relationship, where certain machines are issuing instructions to others, or simply a recognition signal that triggers preset response programs in nearby units, makes a significant difference to how a smart raider should prioritize targets in an engagement, treating certain machines as especially high-value tactical targets because removing them degrades the broader machine response in the area, is a strategy that the behavioral evidence seems to support. 71. The Ark machine's response to the specific activity of raider teams, as compared to their response to isolated raider individuals, is a behavioral nuance that experienced raiders have noted and that has lore implications. Team operations sometimes seem to draw a qualitatively different response than individual operations, one that is more organized and sustained, as though the machines recognize team-scale human activity as a more significant threat than individual activity. If the machines can distinguish between these contexts and modulate their response accordingly, their behavioral sophistication is significantly higher than simple threat detection programming would produce. 72. One of the things the lore suggests about the Ark machines is that they are not all the same age. Some machines appear to have been on Earth since the initial invasion decades ago. Others show characteristics that suggest more recent deployment, or at least more recent construction. If the Ark's presence on Earth has included ongoing deployment of new machine units beyond the initial invasion wave, then the machine population on the surface is not a fixed, slowly depleting asset, but a dynamic one that is being maintained or even grown over time. The implications of this for the long-term survival of underground communities are significant, because it changes the question of whether outlasting the machines is a viable strategy. 73. The physical damage that Ark machines can inflict on humans who encounter them on the surface is worth understanding not just as a gameplay mechanic, but as a lore element that tells you something about the machine's design. The damage capability reflects the threat environment that the machines were designed to operate in. They were built to be effective against human military-grade resistance, and the fact that they overcame that resistance in the early days of the invasion tells you that their capabilities exceeded even the best defensive technology that the pre-invasion world possessed. What raiders face on the surface is the same level of capability, but without the benefit of organized military support, large-scale coordination, or the industrial capacity to maintain a sustained conflict. 74. There is a form of horror in the Ark threat that is specific to its character as a machine intelligence, and that is worth naming directly. The machines do not get tired. They do not doubt themselves. They do not wonder about the ethics of what they're doing. They do not get demoralized when things do not go well. They simply continue pursuing their purpose with whatever operational capacity they have available. Against a human enemy, you can hope to outlast their will. Against the machines, will is not a factor. Their operational persistence is limited only by their mechanical condition and their energy systems, and these appear to be in good shape after decades of operation. This particular quality of the Ark threat is what makes it genuinely different from any threat the pre-invasion world had experience with. 75. The way raiders have adapted to the Ark threat over generations is one of the most interesting aspects of the game's world from an evolutionary perspective. The early raiders were operating without much knowledge of machine behavior. They were learning at enormous cost, developing understanding through encounters that frequently killed them. Over decades, that learning has been partially captured and transmitted, and current raiders operate with a level of practical understanding of Ark machine behavior that the first raiders simply did not have. This accumulated tactical knowledge is one of the most significant assets that the underground communities possess, and the challenge of keeping it current as machine behavior potentially evolves is one of the ongoing challenges of raider training and preparation. 76. The question of whether there have been any instances of Ark machine behavior that could be interpreted as curiosity about humans, as any form of interest in humans as a subject of attention rather than simply as a threat to be managed, is one that the lore community has debated without reaching a clear consensus. There are reports from raiders of machine behavior in specific contexts that seems to go beyond simple threat response, behavior that lingers longer than threat management would require, that orients toward humans in ways that do not fit neatly into a threat response model. Whether these reports reflect genuine anomalous machine behavior or simply the human tendency to find meaning and intention in mechanical processes is difficult to determine from the outside. 77. The environmental footprint of Ark machine operations on the surface is large enough and specific enough that it should, in principle, be legible to anyone with enough knowledge to read it. The specific patterns of Ark-caused environmental modification, taken as a whole, are a kind of map of Ark priorities and activities. The challenge is that reading this map requires the synthesis of observations from across a very large area, observations that no individual raider or community is in a position to collect comprehensively. The lore community's project of assembling these observations into a coherent picture is an ongoing one, and the picture that has emerged so far is interesting and provocative, even where it is not definitive. 78. One of the things that makes the Ark threat feel genuinely threatening rather than simply dangerous, at least in terms of the game's lore design, is its combination of capability with apparent indifference. A human enemy is motivated by something, and that motivation is a potential leverage point. An enemy that can be reasoned with, negotiated with, or whose morale can be targeted is an enemy that has a potential vulnerability in its motivation. The Ark machines have no such vulnerability. They cannot be reasoned with or negotiated with. Their operational commitment does not depend on any motivation that can be disrupted. They will continue doing what they are doing until something physical prevents them from doing it. That combination of high capability with complete motivational indifference is one of the more genuinely alarming threat profiles in the game's lore. 79. The concept of adaptation, which runs through the entire world of Ark Raiders, applies to the machines as well as to the humans. If the machines are capable of behavioral adaptation, then the history of the human-Ark relationship is not simply a history of human adaptation to a static machine threat. It is a co-evolutionary history in which both sides have been changing in response to each other. The humans have adapted their tools, their tactics, their social organization to better deal with the Ark threat, and the machines may have adapted their operations, their patrol patterns, their response protocols to better deal with human raider activity. This mutual adaptation would mean that the Ark Raiders world is not in a static equilibrium, but in a dynamic one, with both sides continuously evolving in response to each other. 80. Understanding the Ark threat, taken as a complete subject, means sitting with the profound uncertainty that the available lore deliberately maintains around the most important questions. Why are the machines here? What are they doing? Where did they come from? What would it take to stop them or to live alongside them? These questions are not answered in the game's lore, and that absence of answer is one of the most important things about them. The Ark is not a mystery that has been solved and is waiting to be discovered. It is a genuine mystery, one that the underground communities have been trying to understand for decades without reaching definitive conclusions. That epistemic situation of people who have been living with an enormous threat for generations without fully understanding it is one of the most honest things about the game's lore design. Chapter 3. The Underground, Survivors, and Civilization 81. When you look at the underground settlements in Ark Raiders, not as locations in a game, but as the product of decades of human community building under extraordinary constraint, they become something considerably more interesting than they first appear. These are not improvised shelters. They are established communities with their own histories, their own cultures, their own ways of managing the full range of human social needs, from governance to recreation, to the transmission of knowledge across generations. The people who live there have not been waiting for something to change. They have been building, continuously, something worth living in. That distinction between waiting and building is one of the most important things to understand about the underground communities as a law subject. 82. The governance structures of the underground settlements represent some of the most practically interesting aspects of the world's design. In the absence of any external governing authority and facing conditions that required immediate, coordinated responses to survive, the early underground communities would have developed governance structures quickly and under pressure. The structures that exist now are the result of decades of evolution from those early emergency arrangements. They vary significantly between settlements based on their founding conditions and their subsequent development, but they tend to share certain features: a greater concentration of decision-making authority than pre-invasion democratic traditions would have found comfortable, a strong emphasis on practical competence as the basis for status, and formal or informal mechanisms for managing the resource conflicts that are a constant feature of constrained community life. 83. The resource management systems of underground communities are, in their own right, an interesting area of applied economics that the game implies without developing in detail. How do communities decide who gets what when there is not enough of everything for everyone? The answers to this question are some of the most consequential decisions that underground governance makes, and different communities have developed different answers based on their histories and their values. Some communities have more egalitarian distribution systems, others have more hierarchical ones that give more to those who contribute more or who hold more authority. Both types of system have their advantages and failure modes in a survival context, and the game's faction system partly reflects these different economic philosophies. 84. The medical systems of the underground communities are one of the most strained and most critical of all their social institutions. The demand for medical care is high, given the injury rates associated with raider work and the general health challenges of underground living. The supply of medical practitioners with significant training is limited because training takes time and resources that the communities struggle to provide. The supply of medical materials is dependent on surface runs that are dangerous and not always successful. The result is that medical care in the underground communities is prioritized based on return on investment in a way that would be ethically troubling in a world of abundance, but that is, in a survival context, a rational response to genuine constraint. The triage ethic of the underground is one of the harder truths about this world. 85. The educational systems of the underground communities are both one of the most important and one of the most challenging things the communities manage. They need to transmit the accumulated knowledge of the community across generations, but that knowledge is not the knowledge of the pre-invasion world. It has been substantially reorganized by the experience of invasion and underground life. The curriculum of the underground includes practical skills that did not exist before the invasion, knowledge about machine behavior and service navigation, and equipment maintenance and community management under constraint. At the same time, the communities want to preserve as much of the pre-invasion knowledge base as possible, both for its intrinsic value and for its potential future relevance. Balancing these two knowledge preservation goals within the constraints of underground educational resources is one of the ongoing challenges of community management. 86. The role of women in the underground communities is worth noting as a law element because the conditions of survival under constraint have probably reorganized gender roles significantly from what the pre-invasion world maintained. When survival is the primary organizing principle, the allocation of roles based on gender rather than on practical capability is a luxury that constrained communities cannot afford. The underground communities have presumably developed more practically determined role allocations, where the question of who does what is organized primarily around who is best placed to do it, rather than around pre-invasion social conventions. This reorganization is not complete or without tension, because social conventions do not dissolve simply because circumstances have changed. But the pressure toward practical role allocation is real and persistent. 87. The relationship between raiders and the communities they serve is one of the more complex social dynamics in the underground world. Raiders provide an essential service, and they have the leverage that essential service providers always have. But the nature of their work, the extended absence from the community, the psychological distance that service experience creates, the elevated mortality that gives their community relationships a particular fragility, makes their social position complicated in ways that go beyond simple economic leverage. Raiders form their tightest social bonds with other raiders rather than with the broader community, not because they dislike the broader community, but because shared experience of the surface creates a bond that is hard to replicate in other relationships. 88. The underground communities have developed their own traditions of celebration and commemoration that are specific to their situation and that would be alien to someone from the pre-invasion world. The successful return of a large raider operation with critical supplies, the repair of a failing critical system that threatened the community, the birth of children, which carries a particular communal weight in a small community where every new life is a contribution to the community's future viability, the death of a particularly significant community member. These are the occasions that the underground communities mark, and that their celebration and mourning traditions have been built around. These traditions are part of the community's identity and part of what makes the community feel like a community rather than simply a group of people sharing a space. 89. The concept of community debt, the obligation that an individual member of a community has to that community in exchange for the resources and protection the community provides, is more explicit and more weighted in the underground communities than it would have been in the pre-invasion world. The resource constraints of underground life make the cost of supporting community members more visible and more significant than it was in a world of relative abundance. This has produced communities that are both more communally interdependent and more demanding of contribution from their members than the pre-invasion world's individualist culture would have found comfortable. The social norms that enforce community contribution and the consequences for those who fail to contribute adequately are some of the harder-edged aspects of underground community life. 90. The trust structures of underground communities, the specific patterns of who trusts whom and under what conditions, are some of the most practically important social facts about these communities. In an environment where information is critical and accurate information is a survival asset, trust in information sources is extremely valuable. The communities have developed, over time, relatively sophisticated informal systems for evaluating the reliability of different information sources, for rating raider reports of surface conditions, for assessing the credibility of claims made by faction representatives. These trust networks are not formal institutions. They are social realities that exist in the accumulated judgment of community members about each other. 91. The physical experience of living underground, the specific sensory texture of enclosed spaces with artificial light and controlled air and constant proximity to other people, has shaped the psychology and the culture of underground residents in ways that are not always visible but that are consistently present. People who have lived their entire lives underground have a different relationship with space than people who have known open environments. They have a different relationship with silence, because truly complete silence is probably not available in a living underground settlement. They have a different relationship with smell and sound and touch, because the sensory environment of underground life is specific and consistent in ways that outdoor environments are not. These differences are part of what makes raiders, who move regularly between underground and surface, a distinct experiential category from underground-only residents. 92. The social norms around conflict resolution in the underground communities are more developed and more consequential than anything in the pre-invasion world's experience, because the consequences of unresolved conflict in a small enclosed community are more severe. When people cannot simply leave, when the community cannot simply expel a troublesome member without significant cost, the resolution of conflict within the community becomes a survival-level priority. The mechanisms that underground communities have developed for managing and resolving conflict, which range from formal mediation processes to informal social pressure, to presumably more coercive interventions in serious cases, are some of the most practically important aspects of their governance systems. 93. The information economy of the underground communities is as significant as their material economy, and in some ways more complex. Information about surface conditions, about machine behavior patterns, about the locations of resources, about the political situations in other settlements, is a commodity that has real value and that flows through the community through networks that are partly formal and partly informal. The factions in the game are, among other things, factions in the information economy, competing for the ability to collect, process, and distribute information in ways that serve their particular interests. Understanding the information economy helps explain why factions behave the way they do, and why raiders are valued not just for what they bring back physically, but for what they know. 94. The relationship between underground communities and the concept of justice is one that the practical constraints of survival have shaped in particular ways. In a community where resources are scarce and the wrong decision can cost lives, justice needs to be practical, fast, and clear. The extended legal processes of the pre-invasion world, designed to protect individual rights in a context of institutional power, are mostly unavailable to communities that do not have the resources to run them. What has replaced them in the underground communities is a more immediate and more community-centered approach to justice, one that is more efficient but that has correspondingly less protection for individuals who find themselves in conflict with community consensus. 95. The underground community's relationship with the past is one that is organized around a careful curation of what is remembered and how. Pre-invasion history is preserved in fragments and in the accounts of elders, but it is also, inevitably, simplified and idealized in ways that reflect the emotional needs of communities living in diminished circumstances. The complexity and the failure of the pre-invasion world is not always fully represented in how communities remember it. This idealization is understandable and probably psychologically necessary, but it creates a potential for the past to be used in ways that are not historically accurate, as a standard against which the present is always found wanting, as a motivation for a future project of restoration that may not be achievable. 96. The daily routines of underground community life are organized around practical necessity in ways that structure the social life of the community in specific ways. Work rotations, meal times, rest periods, all of these are organized to meet the practical requirements of community function. But within that practical structure, there is room for the social interactions that give life its texture: conversation, argument, romantic connection, friendship, the transmission of stories and memories and skills from one person to another. The richness of underground community life is not in spite of its constraints, but partly because of them, because the constraints create intense social proximity that forces the development of deep social skills and relationships. 97. The question of individual ambition in the underground communities is one that the practical context of underground life has both constrained and shaped. Ambition does not disappear in a survival context. People still want status, recognition, material advantage. But the forms that ambition can take are constrained by what is available, and what is available is organised around community function. The most successful channels for individual ambition in the underground communities are those that align with community needs. Becoming an exceptional raider, developing rare technical skills, taking on leadership roles in community governance. These are the forms that ambitious individuals can take their desire for distinction toward, and they are the forms that the community's social structure rewards. 98. One of the more interesting aspects of underground community life is the relationship with mortality that its members develop. In a world where death from raider operations is a common occurrence, and where the medical resources to prevent all deaths from illness and injury are not available, the communities have developed cultural relationships with death that are more open and more normalized than anything in the pre-invasion world's experience. Death is not hidden or sanitized. It is a regular presence in the community's life. The community rituals around death, whatever form they take in specific settlements, reflect this normalization. They are not organized around denying death's reality, but around integrating it into the ongoing life of the community. 99. The underground communities have been in a relationship of competition and cooperation with each other since the early days after the invasion, and that relationship has shaped each community's development in important ways. Communities that have had good cooperative relationships with neighbours have been able to specialise in ways that trading partners allow, focusing on what they do well and exchanging it for what others do well. Communities that have been more isolated or more conflictual with neighbours have had to develop more complete self-sufficiency, which imposes costs but also builds resilience in some areas. The history of intercommunity relations is one of the more interesting aspects of the world's law that the game implies without developing in detail. 100. The underground communities of Ark Raiders represent something that is genuinely worth sitting with: the persistence of human social complexity under conditions that would seem to preclude it. These communities have not simply survived. They have maintained culture, developed governance, preserved knowledge, sustained economic systems, generated art and tradition, and social norms. They have done this not in spite of being under extraordinary pressure, but sometimes because of it, because the pressure has forced the development of social capacities that would not have been needed in more comfortable circumstances. The world of the underground is not a diminished version of the pre-invasion world. It is something new, with its own specific qualities, its own specific achievements, and its own specific beauty. 101. The factions that players encounter in Ark Raiders are the most visible manifestation of the social complexity of underground communities. They are not simple groupings of similar people. They are organized expressions of competing visions of what the community should prioritize and how it should pursue those priorities. The faction that prioritizes resource acquisition is not wrong. The faction that prioritizes defense is not wrong. The faction that prioritizes research and understanding is not wrong. They are all responding to real needs and real constraints. The conflicts between them are not between right and wrong, but between different legitimate answers to the question of what a community in this situation should do. 102. The physical spaces of the underground settlements are, as with the surface ruins, a form of law document that rewards careful observation. The oldest parts of the settlement, built during or immediately after the invasion, have a particular character that reflects the urgency and the resource constraints of that period. The newer parts, added as communities stabilized and grew, reflect a different relationship between function and comfort, one that has more room for the latter as the former became more secure Reading the physical history of a settlement through its construction is one of the ways that environmental storytelling operates in the underground, as well as on the surface. 103. The concept of personal identity in the underground communities is shaped by the specific social context of a small enclosed community in ways that are worth noting. In a large, anonymous pre-invasion city, personal identity was something that individuals could shape relatively freely because the number of people who knew them was a small fraction of the people around them. In a small underground community, everyone knows everyone. Your reputation is not something you manage, it is something you live with continuously. This intense mutual visibility creates a different relationship with identity, one that is more communally negotiated and less individually constructed than the pre-invasion norm. 104. The relationship between underground communities and their raiders is not simply one of employer and employee or community and servant. It is more complex and more mutual than either of those framings captures. Raiders depend on the community for their equipment, their training, their medical care, their social support, their reason for doing what they do. The community depends on raiders for the physical resources that keep it alive. This mutual dependency creates a relationship of genuine interdependence that goes beyond the economic. When a raider is lost, it is a loss to the community in ways that extend well beyond the replacement cost of their equipment and the loss of their surface contribution. It is a loss of a person who is embedded in a web of community relationships that now has a specific absence. 105. The underground community's understanding of the surface world is one of their most critical knowledge assets, and the way they maintain and update it is one of their most important institutional functions. Raider reports of surface conditions are the primary input to this understanding. How these reports are collected, how they are verified, how they are integrated with previous reports to build a current picture of the surface world, how they are distributed to raiders who are planning future operations. These are all functions that the communities perform more or less well, depending on their organizational sophistication. The communities that have the best systems for managing surface intelligence are the ones best positioned to make good operational decisions about surface activities. 106. The children of the underground communities are, from a community perspective, the most important people in the settlement. Not because children are prioritized over adults in resource allocation, necessarily, but because the long-term viability of the community depends on them. Every child represents a future contribution to community function, and the community's investment in raising and educating children is an investment in its own future. The specific form that investment takes, the parenting norms and the educational approaches and the community support systems for families is shaped by the particular constraints and values of each settlement and is one of the more intimate expressions of community culture. 107. The concept of beauty in the underground communities is one that has been substantially reorganized by the constraints and the specific sensory environment of underground life. In the pre-invasion world, beauty was accessible in a wide range of forms, including those that require open space, natural light, the visual variety of outdoor environments. The underground communities do not have access to these forms of beauty in the same way. What they have developed instead are aesthetic traditions that work within their constraints. Music that uses the acoustic properties of enclosed spaces to create specific effects. Visual art that uses available materials in ways that turn constraint into technique. Storytelling that creates an imaginative experience of spaces and environments that the audience may never actually see. The aesthetic life of the underground is not impoverished, it is specific, and that specificity is its own form of richness. 108. One of the more practically interesting aspects of underground community life is the management of what might be called Psychological maintenance. The ongoing work of keeping community members in a state of psychological health adequate to perform their community functions. In a high-stress, resource-constrained, physically confined environment with elevated mortality, the psychological health of community members is a genuine and ongoing challenge. The communities have developed various approaches to this challenge, from the communal rituals and celebrations that provide emotional release and social connection to more informal systems of mutual support, and to whatever medical capacity for psychological intervention exists in each settlement. The specific approaches that each community has developed are expressions of its particular culture and values. 109. The question of what raiders do between surface runs, how they spend the time when they are underground, is an interesting lore question that the game does not address directly. Raiders presumably participate in community life in the ways that all community members do, but they also have specific needs in the interrun period that other community members do not. Equipment maintenance and repair, physical conditioning maintenance, processing of surface experience, which is psychologically complex in ways that underground life is not. Preparation for future runs, including intelligence gathering and planning. The interrun life of a raider is its own subject, and the specific routines and practices that raiders have developed for managing it are part of the broader culture of the raider community. 110. The underground community's relationship with the idea of the future has been shaped by decades of operating under conditions where the future is uncertain enough that long-term planning often seems futile. And yet communities plan. They invest in infrastructure improvements that will take years to pay off. They train children for roles they will not be old enough to fill for years. They maintain records and traditions that serve the community's long-term identity more than its immediate needs. This capacity for long-term investment under uncertainty is one of the more impressive aspects of underground community life, and it is the evidence that these communities have moved beyond simple survival mode into something that genuinely qualifies as civilization. 111. The underground communities have had to manage the particular challenge of maintaining organizational continuity through leadership transitions in an environment where leadership is often lost abruptly rather than through planned succession. When a community leader dies suddenly, whether from illness, from injury, from a surface run that goes wrong, the community needs to have systems for managing the transition without losing the institutional knowledge that the leader carried. The succession systems that communities have developed, formal or informal, are one of the more important governance elements in the underground world, and their quality varies significantly between communities. 112. The concept of exile from the underground community is one that the game implies is a possibility without developing it in any detail. Expulsion from a community in the context of the underground world is a severe punishment because there is very little viable life outside of organized communities. An exiled person would face the choice between attempting to survive on the surface, an extremely difficult proposition, or attempting to reach another community and be accepted there. The severity of this consequence means that exile is presumably reserved for the most serious violations of community norms. Its existence as a possibility shapes the behavior of community members in ways that milder consequences might not. 113. The underground community's relationships with their own histories are one of the most humanizing aspects of the world. Communities have invested in preserving their histories, in maintaining records of who they are and where they came from and what they have been through. This investment in historical memory is not merely nostalgic. It is part of the community's identity infrastructure, the thing that allows members to understand themselves as part of a community with a past and a future, rather than simply a group of people sharing a space in the present. The specific histories that communities tell themselves about themselves are shaped by their current needs and values, and reading those histories carefully reveals as much about the community as it tells. 114. One of the things worth noting about the underground community's social structure is the role of informal networks alongside formal structures. The formal governance structure of a community is one layer of its social organization. But beneath and alongside it, there are informal networks of trust and obligation and information sharing that are at least as important for how the community actually functions. The Raider community is one such informal network with its own norms and relationships that operates somewhat independently of the formal governance structure. Factional networks are another. The relationship between the formal and informal structures of underground community life is one of the more interesting aspects of its social design. 115. The underground communities maintain something that might be called institutional resilience, the capacity to keep functioning through individual losses and local disruptions without losing their overall coherence. This resilience is built through redundancy in critical functions, through the broad distribution of key knowledge rather than its concentration in a few individuals, through governance structures that can function without any specific individual, and through the cultural cohesion that gives community members a reason to invest in the community's survival, even when doing so has personal costs. Building and maintaining this resilience is one of the most important things that community governance does, even if it is not always recognized as such. 116. The relationship between raiders and the factions they work with or for is one of the more practically interesting aspects of the game's social structure. Raiders need factions for the resources and support that factions provide. Factions need raiders for the surface capacity that raiders represent. This mutual dependency creates a working relationship that is complex in its details. Raiders who are deeply aligned with a specific faction's mission may prioritize that faction's interests in ways that other faction members find reassuring. Raiders who are more mercenary in their faction relationships may use faction resources without providing the faction-aligned service that the faction's leadership would prefer. Managing this variation in raider loyalty is one of the ongoing challenges of faction management. 117. The concept of what it means to be home in the underground communities is one that the particular character of underground life has shaped in interesting ways. Home in the underground is not primarily a physical space, though it has a physical dimension. It is a social and psychological reality, the feeling of being in a place where you're known and where you belong, where your history is shared and your future is connected to others. This feeling of home is something that the underground communities have built carefully over decades, partly through the maintenance of physical spaces that are specifically community spaces rather than simply functional spaces, and partly through the rituals and traditions and shared histories that give communities their specific identity. 118. The underground community's capacity for innovation within their constraints is one of the more impressive aspects of their development over time. Faced with resource constraints that would seem to preclude development, these communities have nonetheless developed new approaches, new tools, new social arrangements, new technical solutions. The rate of innovation is lower than in the pre-invasion world, because the resources available to support it are much more limited. But innovation has not stopped. People who live in constrained environments still think, still solve problems, still find better ways to do things. The specific innovations that underground communities have produced, shaped by their specific constraints and needs, are in some ways more impressive than pre-invasion innovations, precisely because they were achieved with so much less. 119. The underground communities have preserved something that is perhaps the most important thing they could have preserved, and that is the capacity to be surprised and to adapt. They have not calcified into rigid organizations that can only do what they have always done. They have maintained enough flexibility, enough internal debate, enough toleration for the person who says the current approach is not working, that they have been able to change when circumstances required it. This organizational flexibility is not universal across all communities. Some have become more rigid than others, but its presence in enough communities is part of what makes the human situation in Ark Raiders feel like one of ongoing possibility rather than simply slow decline. 120. The world underground is real and it is worth caring about. That is the claim that this chapter has been building toward, and it is the claim that the game's design makes at every level. The people underground have built something. It is not what they would have built if the Ark had not come, but it is something, and it is human, and it has the kind of depth and complexity that earns attention and respect. When raiders go to the surface and risk their lives, the thing they are doing it for is not abstract. It is specific communities with specific histories and specific people who matter to each other. That specificity is what makes the stakes of Ark Raiders feel real. Chapter 4. The Raiders, Who You Are, and Why It Matters. 121. Being a raider in the world of Ark Raiders is not something most people would choose if they had other viable choices. It is a role that people arrive at through a combination of aptitude and necessity, and probably in some cases, something closer to a pull that they cannot entirely explain. The game does not spend much time on how your character ended up in this role, which is appropriate. The underground communities do not have a lot of time for extended personal history. You have skills. There is work to be done. The conversation happens quickly, and the job starts almost immediately. This directness is part of the authenticity of the world. 122. The physical and psychological profile that makes for an effective raider is specific and not universal. It requires a particular relationship with risk that is neither fearlessness nor recklessness, but something closer to a managed acceptance. Fearlessness would make a raider reckless, and recklessness kills raiders. A raider who cannot feel fear cannot respond appropriately to the information that fear provides. What effective raiders have developed is not the absence of fear, but the ability to have fear without being controlled by it, to let it inform their awareness and their decisions without overwhelming their capacity to function. This is a psychological skill, and it is one that is developed through practice in the way that all skills are. 123. The equipment that a raider carries is not incidental to their identity. The specific configuration of gear that an individual raider develops over time is the physical expression of their accumulated experience, of what they have learned works and what has cost them in the field. Experienced raiders develop strongly personalized equipment configurations that reflect the specific environments they operate in and the specific operational style they have developed. These configurations are the result of extensive trial and error, of things that worked and things that failed, and they carry the history of that learning in their specifics. Understanding a raider's equipment is, in a sense, understanding their biography. 124. The learning curve for a new raider is steep in ways that the game captures through its mechanical design. The gap between what a new raider needs to know and what they actually know when they start their first surface run is significant. This gap is managed, in the world's lore, through the training and mentorship that the underground communities provide before sending new raiders to the surface, but no amount of preparation is equivalent to actual surface experience. The things that kill new raiders are mostly things that training could not fully prepare them for, because they are the things that can only be understood through encountering them. The communities that lose the fewest new raiders are the ones that have found the best ways to provide supervised early exposure to surface conditions. 125. The social relationships that form between raiders who operate together are among the most intense in the underground world. The combination of high stakes, complete mutual dependence, and the specific psychological experience of surface exposure creates bonds that are difficult to replicate in other social contexts. Raiders who have operated together for extended periods develop a form of mutual knowledge that goes well beyond conscious awareness. They know how the other person moves, how they respond to specific types of situations, what their particular strengths and failure modes are. This knowledge is not intellectual, it is embodied. And it is one of the reasons that breaking up effective raider teams, even for individually rational reasons, is something that experienced operations managers do with reluctance. 126. The decision-making that raiders perform under pressure on the surface is one of the more interesting aspects of the role from a psychological perspective. Surface operations regularly produce situations where decisions have to be made quickly and under conditions that compromise the quality of thinking. Elevated heart rate, stress hormones, the narrowing of attention that comes with acute threat response, all of these affect cognitive function in ways that trained raiders have learned to manage. To some extent, the techniques they use for maintaining decision quality under pressure, which range from pre-planned responses to common situations to specific breathing practices to the distribution of monitoring functions across team members, are part of the practical knowledge of surface operation that is transmitted through the raider training and mentorship system. 127. The extraction decision, the calculation of when it is time to get out regardless of what has not yet been accomplished, is one of the most important and most consistently difficult decisions that raiders make. There is always more that could be done. There are always resources that have not yet been collected, areas that have not yet been explored, intelligence that has not yet been gathered. The pressure to push further, to maximize the value of a surface run, has to be balanced against the increasing risk that comes with extended surface exposure. Getting this balance wrong in either direction has costs. Pulling back too soon leaves value on the table and may mean the community goes without something it needs. Pushing too far means risking everything, including the equipment and personnel whose loss the community can least afford. 128. The way raiders read the surface environment is one of the more sophisticated cognitive skills they develop, and it is one that is built out of a very large number of specific observational experiences integrated into a pattern recognition system that eventually operates partly below the level of conscious awareness. Experienced raiders notice things that they cannot always articulate as specific observations. They have a feeling about a space, a sense of whether something is not right. That is actually the product of a very large number of small perceptual signals being integrated by a trained perceptual system. This developed environmental intuition is one of the markers of experience that is hardest to transmit through explicit training, and that most clearly separates experienced raiders from inexperienced ones. 129. The moral complexity of raider work is something that the game engages with through its design without making it the explicit subject of its narrative. Raiders operate in a world where resources are desperately scarce and where the things they bring back are genuinely life or death for their community. In that context, the moral calculus of specific decisions is not always clear-cut. The right to take resources from a location where others might also need them. The decision about whether to engage with another raider who seems to be heading into a dangerous situation. The management of situations where the interests of the community and the interests of a specific individual are in tension. These are not simple moral situations, and the raider culture that has developed around them reflects their complexity. 130. The physical demands of raider work are significant enough that physical conditioning is a central element of raider preparation and maintenance. Surface operations require sustained physical activity under load in an environment with variable and often challenging terrain. The specific conditioning program that Raiders maintain is organized around the specific physical demands of surface work rather than around general fitness. It includes strength training sufficient to manage the loads Raiders carry, endurance training sufficient for extended surface operations, specific mobility and agility training relevant to navigating ruins, and probably specific training in the physical skills of combat movement, because the ability to move effectively under threat is a survival requirement. 131. The cultural identity of Raiders as a distinct social category within the underground communities is one of the more interesting aspects of the game's world design. Raiders are not just people who have a specific job. They are a distinct subculture with their own norms, their own traditions, their own humour, their own understanding of what matters and what does not. This cultural distinctness is the product of their specific experience. The surface world does something to people that other parts of underground community life do not, and that something is visible in the culture and the social identity of Raiders as a group. 132. The concept of Raider retirement is an interesting lore question that the game implies without developing. What happens when a Raider can no longer operate at the level the surface requires? The knowledge and experience of a long career Raider is enormously valuable. The physical and psychological capacity to use that knowledge on the surface has a limit that eventually closes. The transition from active surface operation to a different form of community contribution is something that different communities and different individual Raiders handle in different ways. For some, the transition is to instruction and mentorship of new Raiders. For others, it is to intelligence analysis and operational planning. For others still, it may be to community governance, where the practical judgment developed through years of high-stakes decision-making is a significant asset. 133. The emotional relationship that Raiders have with the communities they serve is real and complicated in ways that do not map neatly onto simple loyalty or simple obligation. Raiders do care about the communities they serve, about the specific people in those communities, about the faces they see when they return from a successful run. That caring is part of what motivates them to take the risks they take. It is also part of what makes the losses they experience, the colleagues who do not come back, the families who lose members to the surface, genuinely painful rather than abstract. The emotional weight of Raider work is carried by the specific relationships it involves rather than by any abstract commitment. 134. The way Raiders talk about the surface world when they are underground is one of the more culturally interesting aspects of Raider life. The surface is simultaneously the most dangerous place they go and the place that defines who they are. It is the source of their status and the source of their risk. The language that Raiders use to talk about it, the stories they tell, the way they describe specific surface experiences, reflects this complicated relationship. There is pride in it. There is also something darker, a kind of intimate familiarity with something that most people never experience and would not want to. The storytelling culture of Raiders is part of how they process their surface experience and part of how they maintain their identity as a distinct community. 135. The tactical creativity that effective Raiders develop is one of the most interesting aspects of the role from a practical perspective. The surface world does not present Raiders with the same situation twice in exactly the same way. Machine positions change, structural conditions change, weather changes, the resources available change, the specific composition and condition of the Raider team changes. Effective Raiders have developed the capacity to generate tactical responses to specific situations rather than simply applying pre-learned approaches to situations they recognize. This tactical creativity, the ability to see the specific features of a new situation and generate a response that fits it, is the mark of experience that no amount of training can fully substitute for. 136. The physical relationship that raiders develop with their equipment over time is one that goes beyond simple familiarity with operating it. The specific weight and balance of a weapon, the particular way that a piece of armor distributes its load, the feel of the controls on a piece of surface equipment, these become part of the proprioceptive experience of the raider who uses them. Well-maintained, long-used equipment becomes an extension of the raider's physical self in a way that newly issued equipment never is. This is part of why raiders resist equipment changes even when the changes are objectively improvements. The psychological cost of losing the embodied familiarity with specific equipment is real and is part of what experienced raiders communicate to operational planners. 137. The relationship that raiders have with each other across team boundaries with raiders they do not operate with regularly but encounter within the raider community more broadly is one of the more interesting social dynamics of underground life. There is a common identity that connects raiders who do not regularly team together, a recognition of shared experience and shared values that creates a form of solidarity across team boundaries. This broader raider community identity is the social context within which individual team relationships exist, and it shapes how raiders from different teams treat each other both underground and on the surface. 138. The specific knowledge that raiders develop about particular areas of the surface world is one of the most practically valuable forms of knowledge in the underground communities. A raider who has operated extensively in a specific area knows that area in ways that go well beyond what any written account or intelligence brief can convey. They know its specific structural character, its particular machine patrol patterns, its resource distribution, its navigational challenges, and its navigational advantages. This area-specific knowledge is not easily transferred. The best transfer happens through operating together in the same area with someone who already knows it well. Losing a raider who had deep knowledge of a specific surface area is a specific form of community loss that takes time and further exposure to replace. 139. The psychological experience of returning from a surface run is something that raiders develop specific routines for managing. The transition from the high alert state of surface operation to the relative safety of the underground is not automatic or immediate. The nervous system that has been primed for threat detection on the surface does not immediately down-regulate when the access point closes behind you. The specific practices that raiders use for managing this transition, whether they are formal rituals, physical practices, social routines, or simply time, are part of the practical knowledge of raider life that is transmitted through the community of practitioners. 140. The raiders of Ark Raiders are ultimately defined not by what they do in any single exceptional moment, but by what they do consistently, across hundreds of runs and years of exposure, in conditions that most people would not survive at all. The quiet persistence of continued operation, the accumulation of runs and knowledge and loss and recovery, the ability to go out again after the last run cost something that mattered, this is the shape that raider heroism takes. It is not dramatic in the way that narrative heroism tends to be. It is the heroism of people doing a hard job because someone has to do it, and doing it well because the consequences of doing it badly are not only personal. Chapter 5. The Surface World. Zones, Locations and Hazards. 141. The surface world of Ark Raiders is one of the most detailed and most carefully constructed game environments in recent memory, and the way to approach it as a lore document and as a tactical environment is as a space with genuine history that rewards careful reading. Every zone of the surface has a pre-invasion character that determined what was built there and what kinds of resources are available. That pre-invasion character has then been overlaid with decades of machine presence, of ecological change, of raider activity, and of the specific physical processes of abandonment and decay. Reading any specific surface location means reading all of those layers simultaneously, and the skill of reading them well is one of the things that separates the best raiders from everyone else. 142. The industrial zones of the surface world are among the most resource-rich and most dangerous areas that raiders operate in. Pre-invasion industrial facilities were built to be resource-dense, containing large quantities of raw materials, manufactured components, specialized equipment, and the infrastructure for processing and producing things at scale. That resource density persists in the ruins, in forms that are more or less accessible depending on how the specific facility has aged and what machine activity has done to it. The danger of industrial zones is commensurate with their value. Machine patrol presence tends to be heavier in industrial zones than in residential or commercial zones, for reasons that the lore suggests are connected to what the machines are interested in doing on the surface. 143. Residential zones are the other end of the value-danger spectrum from industrial zones. They tend to have lower concentrations of high-value resources and lighter machine patrol presence. For raiders who are early in their development, or who are operating under specific time or risk constraints, residential zones represent a safer entry point into surface operations. The resources available there tend to be more dispersed and more domestic in character, useful for community life rather than for heavy engineering. The emotional texture of residential zones is also distinct, because they are the spaces where pre-invasion domestic life was most concentrated, and the evidence of that life is everywhere, and is some of the most affecting environmental storytelling in the game. 144. The transit zones, the surface areas between the high-value operational zones, are often treated by raiders as simply spaces to move through quickly, rather than as zones in their own right. This is a mistake, both tactically and from a lore perspective. Transit zones are the spaces where raiders are most exposed and most predictable in their movement. Machine patrol patterns in transit zones are designed to exploit this predictability, and from a lore perspective, transit zones often contain evidence of early invasion human defensive activity that is absent from the more high-profile zones, because transit zones were the natural places where defensive lines would have been established during the initial response to the invasion. 145. The areas around Ark construction or installation sites are the most dangerous on the surface, and among the most lore-interesting. Machine presence is highest here, patrol patterns are most organised, and the consequences of detection are most severe. But these are also the places where the most direct evidence of what the Ark is actually doing exists. The structures and installations that the machines have built or modified are most concentrated here, and reading them closely is one of the primary ways that the lore community has developed theories about Ark purpose. Raiders who push into these areas are taking significant risks, but they are also the ones most likely to come back with information that genuinely changes how the community understands the threat it faces. 146. The elevated positions available on the surface, whatever remains of taller structures, are both among the most tactically valuable and among the most tactically risky positions available to raiders. From height, you can observe machine movement across a much larger area than ground-level visibility allows. You can see patrol patterns, identify resource-rich locations, spot other raider teams before potentially dangerous encounters with them. But elevated positions also make you visible in ways that ground-level positions do not. The decision to take an elevated position requires knowing the specific machine's sensory capabilities in a given area and assessing whether the observation advantage is worth the detection risk. 147. Water features on the surface have changed significantly since the invasion. Without the maintenance of pre-invasion flood control infrastructure, drainage systems have failed and water has reclaimed areas that were previously dry. Rivers and lakes have changed their courses and their extents, as 30-plus years of non-maintenance have taken effect on the hydraulic systems that controlled them. For raiders, this changed water landscape is both a navigation challenge and an opportunity. Water barriers limit movement, but they also shape machine patrol patterns in ways that can be exploited. And bodies of water are one of the surface environments where machine patrol density tends to be lower, because the acoustic environment of water makes precise sensing more difficult for certain machine sensor types. 148. The underground access points are among the most strategically critical locations in the game world, and protecting their security is one of the underground community's most serious institutional commitments. The specific locations of access points are tightly controlled information, shared only with those who need to know it. The physical security of access points, both the surface side mechanisms that allow them to be opened and closed, and the underground side infrastructure that prevents them from being used as invasion routes into the settlement, is maintained with more care and more redundancy than almost any other piece of community infrastructure. A compromised access point is potentially a catastrophic threat to community security. 149. The navigational challenges of the surface world are more complex than simply finding routes between locations. The surface environment changes continuously, if slowly, as structures deteriorate, as vegetation grows, as Ark machine activity modifies the terrain. Routes that were reliable a season ago may not be reliable now. The current navigational knowledge of the surface world, the up-to-date picture of which routes are passable and which are not, which areas have seen recent machine activity that has changed their character, is one of the most perishable forms of intelligence that raiders gather and communities manage. Keeping that knowledge current requires continuous raider operation, which means that the community's navigation intelligence is always a function of how recently they have been able to operate in each area. 150. The experience of operating on the surface at night is qualitatively different from daytime operations in ways that the game captures through its design and that the lore supports as an important operational variable. The specific balance of advantage and disadvantage that darkness provides for raiders versus machines depends on the particular sensor capabilities of the machines in any given area. In areas where machine sensors are primarily visual, darkness provides more cover. In areas where machines rely more on non-visual sensing, darkness may provide less cover than it appears to offer. Experienced raiders develop a nuanced understanding of how lighting conditions affect the machine threat in specific areas, and they factor that understanding into their operational timing decisions. 151. The specific archaeology of the surface world, the layers of evidence for what happened in what order, is one of the most interesting aspects of close environmental observation. Surface zones carry evidence of the pre-invasion period, the invasion period, the immediate post-invasion period of maximum chaos, the subsequent decades of machine occupation, the history of raider activity in the zone, and the ongoing ecological changes of the current period. Reading these layers in sequence builds up a picture of the specific history of each location that is as rich as any written historical account. The game rewards the player who approaches the surface world as a historian as well as a tactician. 152. The wildlife that has returned to the surface world in the decades since the invasion is both an ecological reality and a lore element that tells you something about the specific character of the Ark's surface operations. Animals exist in the surface world. They have reorganized their behavioral patterns around the presence of machines in ways that reflect decades of learned avoidance. Their presence in certain areas and absence in others maps imperfectly but meaningfully onto the patterns of machine activity. Areas with dense machine presence tend to have lower animal activity, not because the machines actively prey on animals, but because animal behavioral avoidance of machines is strong enough to deplete animal presence in heavily patrolled areas over time. 153. The sound environment of the surface is one of the aspects of surface operation that new raiders are least prepared for, and that experienced raiders have learnt to use as an information system. The specific acoustic environment of any location on the surface carries information about what is happening in that location and in its vicinity. The sound of a machine patrol at distance is different from the sound of a machine patrol that has detected something. The specific acoustic signature of different machine types moving through different terrain types is part of the perceptual knowledge that experienced raiders have developed. Learning to read the surface's acoustic environment accurately is one of the more difficult perceptual skills of raider work. 154. The structural condition of specific surface ruins is a variable that experienced raiders assess almost automatically as part of their general environmental awareness. Not all ruins are equally safe to operate in. Some are structurally stable enough to support raider movement and temporary positioning without significant collapse risk. Others are ready to fail under any significant additional stress. The specific indicators of structural instability, the particular patterns of crack formation, the specific types of deformation that precede structural failure, the acoustic signatures of structure under stress are part of the practical, environmental knowledge that experienced raiders have developed through exposure. Getting this assessment wrong has obvious and serious consequences. 155. One of the more interesting features of the surface world from a lore perspective is the evidence of what other raider teams have done there before. Previous raider activity leaves traces in the surface environment that are legible to someone with the knowledge to read them. Used campsites with specific features, cleared areas where raider teams have removed debris to improve movement routes, signs of salvage activity in specific locations. These traces are a form of community history made physical, and they tell a story about what the communities have been looking for and where they have looked that no written record fully captures. 156. The specific zones of the surface world where multiple types of activity converge, where heavy machine presence meets high resource density, meets evidence of significant pre-invasion human activity, are the most complex and most rewarding areas for raiders who have developed the skill to operate in them. They are complex because the multiple overlapping systems create tactical situations that require integrating a lot of information simultaneously. They are rewarding because the combination of resource density and lore significance means that operating successfully in them produces both material and informational value of the highest order. They are the proving grounds of the most experienced raiders. 157. The surface world of Ark Raiders is ultimately the central lore document of the game. Everything that matters about this world is either contained in the surface environment or is reflected in how communities and individuals relate to it. The history of the pre-invasion world, the history of the invasion, the ongoing activities of the Ark machines, the decades of human adaptation and survival, the specific ecology of a world that has been changing without human management for a generation. All of these things are written in the physical fabric of the surface world, waiting for someone who knows how to read them. That act of reading, that sustained attention to a world that rewards it, is one of the things that makes Ark Raiders genuinely interesting as a game and as a lore subject. 158. The relationship between seasonal conditions and raider operations is one that experienced raiders have learned to manage, and that newer raiders often underestimate. Different seasons bring different challenges and different opportunities. Winter on the surface brings reduced visibility, which can work in raiders' favour in terms of machine optical sensing, but which complicates navigation and slows movement. It also brings cold exposure risk that adds a layer of biological challenge to the operational risks of surface work. Summer brings different visibility conditions, different vegetation states, different noise environments. The raider who operates effectively across all seasonal conditions is significantly more capable than one who has only developed competence in a single seasonal context. 159. The specific microclimatic variations across the surface world are another variable that experienced raiders have learned to read and use. Areas near water have different humidity and temperature profiles from areas far from water. Ruins with good solar exposure dry out faster after rain and freeze less severely in cold weather than shaded areas. Elevation affects temperature and wind. These microclimatic variations have both practical significance for raider comfort and health and tactical significance for surface operations, because they affect the sensory environment in ways that have implications for detection by machine systems. 160. One of the more dangerous features of the surface world that new raiders underestimate is the risk of structural collapse during combat. When combat involves explosive effects or significant kinetic impact, the stress placed on already compromised structures can trigger collapses that are more dangerous than the combat itself. Experienced raiders account for this risk in their combat positioning, preferring to engage in ways that minimize the risk of being caught in a collapse. This preference affects their tactical choices in ways that are not always visible to observers who do not know why certain positions are avoided. 161. The navigational mental model that experienced raiders maintain of the surface world is one of the most valuable cognitive assets in the raider community. This mental model is not simply a map of locations. It is a dynamic representation of the surface world that includes the current condition of various areas, the machine activity patterns that have been observed recently, the structural condition of key routes and locations, and the resource state of areas that have been recently operated in. Maintaining this mental model requires continuous updating from new raider reports and continuous reassessment as conditions change. The raiders who have the most accurate and comprehensive mental models of their operational areas are the ones who can make the best decisions in the field. 162. The relationship between surface zones and the underground community's strategic planning is one that the game implies through the faction system and the quest structure without making fully explicit. Different zones have different strategic importance to different factions based on their specific resource content and their operational characteristics. The allocation of raider resources across different zones, the decision about which zones to prioritize and which to leave for later or leave to other teams is a strategic planning function that the communities perform continuously and that their outcomes depend on heavily. Getting zone prioritization wrong, investing raider capacity in zones that do not produce adequate return relative to the cost of operating in them, is a form of strategic failure that has real community consequences. 163. The surface world is not static. It changes, slowly but continuously, in ways that have implications for how raiders operate and how communities plan. Machine activity modifies the terrain. Structural deterioration continues. Ecological processes advance. Ark installations change as they are built out or maintained or modified. Raider activity itself changes the surface world, depleting resources in exploited areas and leaving traces of activity that may affect future operations. The communities that maintain the most current picture of surface conditions, that update their knowledge base most consistently with new radar intelligence, are the ones best positioned to allocate their operational capacity efficiently. 164. The experience of moving through the surface world as a raider, the specific combination of environmental observation, threat awareness, physical navigation, and team coordination that constitutes surface movement, is one of those complex human activities that is difficult to describe fully from the outside, but that is deeply familiar to those who practice it. It is a form of expertise that is embodied as much as cognitive, that lives in the body's trained responses to environmental stimuli as much as in the conscious analysis of information. The raiders who have developed this embodied expertise move through the surface world in a qualitatively different way from those who have not, and the difference is visible to any observer who knows what to look for. 165. The surface world will continue to change as long as the Ark machines are on it. The ecological processes that are reshaping the pre-invasion landscape will continue. The structural deterioration of surface buildings will continue. The machine installations will continue to develop. The radar activity that leaves its own marks on the surface will continue. The surface world of Ark Raiders is not a fixed environment that the game has captured at a specific moment. It is a world in process, and the specific moment that any raider operates in is just one frame in a longer sequence of change. Understanding that dynamic quality of the surface world, its ongoing transformation rather than its static state, is one of the marks of an experienced surface operator and an engaged lore reader. 166. The zones of the surface world that have been most thoroughly explored by previous raider generations are the ones that the current generation has the best intelligence about and the most experience in. The zones at the edges of explored territory, the areas that have seen less radar activity or where previous radar activity has been less thoroughly reported back to the community, are areas of greater uncertainty and therefore greater risk. But they are also areas of greater potential reward because they have not yet been depleted by previous exploitation. The balance between the known and the unknown in surface operations is one of the ongoing strategic tensions in the Raiders world. 167. The surface world rewards patience in a way that many Raiders learn the hard way. The impulse to move quickly through the surface, to get in and get out as fast as possible, is understandable and sometimes appropriate. But the best surface operators have learned that patience, specifically the patience to observe before moving, to wait for machine patrol windows, to open rather than trying to force movement when the timing is not right, to take the time to read an area thoroughly before committing to a position or a route, is one of the most important skills of surface operation. The raiders who have internalized this patience are the ones whose runs tend to have the best outcomes. 168. The physical and sensory familiarity that experienced raiders develop with specific surface areas is one of the more interesting aspects of the relationship between raiders and the surface world. A raider who has operated many times in a specific area develops a familiarity with it that goes well beyond intellectual knowledge. They know how the air smells in different weather conditions. They know the specific acoustic character of different parts of the area, which areas carry sound and which are acoustically dead. They know the specific feel of the ground surface, which paths are stable and which are deceptive. This sensory familiarity is a survival asset that is as important as any other form of operational knowledge, and it is the thing that most clearly cannot be transmitted to someone who has not built it through their own exposure. 169. One of the more philosophically interesting aspects of the surface world as a lore subject is the question of what it means that the surface is simultaneously where humanity came from and where humanity cannot currently live. The underground communities are not where humans are meant to be. In any deep ecological or revolutionary sense, humans evolved on the surface. Their bodies are calibrated for it. Their psychology was shaped by it. The forced relocation to underground existence is, at a fundamental level, a displacement from the environment that produced the species. What that displacement does to humans over generations, how it changes not just their culture and their psychology, but potentially their biology, is one of the longer Ark questions that the lore of Ark Raiders raises. 170. The surface world, as I've tried to present it throughout this chapter, is not simply a setting for game encounters. It is a world with a past and with an ongoing present that is changing and developing in ways that matter for the future. The ruins of the pre-invasion world are not just obstacles, they are a record of what was. The ecological changes are not just visual dressing, they are a measure of time past. The machine installations are not just enemy positions, they are evidence of purpose. Reading the surface world as a document, rather than simply moving through it as a gameplay environment, is what gives the game its lore depth and is what makes it worth the extended attention that this video represents. Chapter 6: Weapons, Gear and Combat Systems. 171. The weapons and gear of Ark Raiders are designed from a world-building perspective to tell you something true about the communities that produce them. They are not the weapons of a well-supplied professional military with access to advanced manufacturing. They are the weapons of communities that have been working with constrained resources for decades, that have had to maximize effectiveness within severe material limitations, and that have developed a pragmatic engineering culture that values maintainability and adaptability over peak performance. The specific design language of Raider equipment, the way it combines pre-invasion, salvaged components with newly manufactured parts in a way that is functional rather than elegant, is one of the more honest things about the game's aesthetic. 172. The firearms that Raiders carry reflect the manufacturing realities of the underground communities. The communities have access to the knowledge and some of the machinery required to produce functional firearms, but not to the precision manufacturing capacity that produced pre-invasion military-grade weapons. What they produce is a range of weapons that are effective, serviceable, and repairable with the tools and materials available underground, even where they fall short of pre-invasion military specifications in terms of tolerances and reliability. The specific character of each weapon type, the trade-offs it makes between different performance parameters, reflects the specific constraints of the manufacturing context that produced it. 173. The ammunition economy is one of the most important logistical realities of surface operations, and understanding it is one of the things that distinguishes experienced raiders from inexperienced ones. Ammunition is not infinitely available. It has to be manufactured underground using materials that themselves have to be sourced from the surface or salvaged from surface caches. The cost of ammunition in community resources is significant, and the expectation that raiders will manage their ammunition use efficiently, that they will not expend resources in ways that are not warranted by the operational situation, is one of the standard elements of raider operational culture. Raiders who consistently exhaust their ammunition before completing their missions are raiders whose operational judgment is being questioned. 174. The armor and protective gear available to raiders represents one of the more challenging engineering problems that the underground communities face. Pre-invasion military body armor was the product of specialized industrial processes that cannot be replicated underground with available resources. The alternatives that communities have developed are functional, but involve trade-offs. Coverage may be lower than ideal, weight may be higher than optimal. The specific character of the protection provided may not align perfectly with the specific threats that raiders face. But within these limitations, the underground communities have produced protective systems that represent a genuine engineering achievement, and managing the trade-offs between protection and mobility that any specific system imposes is part of the tactical skill set of experienced raiders. 175. The communication systems that raider teams use for surface coordination are one of the most technically sophisticated elements of raider equipment. Maintaining reliable communication between team members across the complex acoustic and electromagnetic environment of a ruins-covered surface is not a simple engineering problem. Pre-invasion communication equipment, salvaged from the surface, often does not have the specific characteristics required for raider operations. The custom communication systems that underground technical teams have developed are among the more impressive engineering products of the underground communities, representing the application of significant technical knowledge and creativity to a specific operational requirement. 176. The medical equipment that raiders carry in the field is a curated subset of the medical resources that the underground communities possess, selected for the specific types of injuries and medical emergencies that surface operations are most likely to generate. Trauma management, wound sealing, pain management, infection prevention, these are the priorities that field medical kits are organized around. The knowledge required to use these kits effectively is transmitted through raider training, because a kit that requires specialized medical knowledge to use is less effective in the field than one that can be used by any trained raider in an emergency. The design of field medical kits is therefore partly a matter of specifying the intervention type that any raider can be trained to perform. 177. The maintenance culture that has developed around raider equipment is one of the more interesting aspects of raider community life. Well-maintained equipment is a survival requirement, and the specific practices around equipment maintenance, the regular inspection cycles, the specific repair techniques for common failure modes, the improvisation protocols for field repair with limited materials, are as much a part of raider professional culture as anything else they do. The raiders who maintain their equipment best tend to be the ones who survive longest, which is both a practical observation and a selection mechanism that has shaped the maintenance culture of the raider community over time. 178. The loadout discipline that effective raiders develop, the specific skill of configuring their equipment correctly for any given mission, is one of the more cognitively demanding aspects of surface operation preparation. The variables involved in a loadout decision include the specific objectives of the mission, the expected threat environment, the expected operational duration, the specific skills and equipment of other team members, and the physical capacity of the individual raider to carry the weight and bulk of any given configuration. Getting any of these variables wrong creates either operational capability gaps or operational inefficiency, both of which have performance consequences. 179. The improvised weapon systems that raiders have developed from salvaged Ark machine components are one of the more interesting engineering areas implied by the game's lore. The machines that arrive on the surface are made of materials and components that, in some cases, have no underground manufactured equivalent. Some of these components have been repurposed into elements of raider weapons and equipment. The specific properties of Ark machine materials, whatever they are, make certain applications possible that are not achievable with conventionally available materials. The raiders and technical communities that have figured out how to work with these materials have developed capabilities that give them an advantage over communities that have not. 180. The combat system of Ark Raiders, as a design expression of the lore reality it represents, is built around the fundamental tension between the raiders' limited resources and the machine's significant capabilities. Raiders cannot simply outgun the Ark. They cannot absorb unlimited damage and keep fighting. They cannot use unlimited ammunition and not run out. Every combat decision is therefore a resource management decision, as well as a tactical one. The systems of the game, the way they constrain player options, mirror the real constraints that Raiders operate under in the world, and understanding this relationship between the game's mechanics and the world's lore is one of the ways that the two levels of engagement reinforce each other. 181. The specific role that each team member plays in a surface operation is not fixed in the way that a formal military role assignment would be. Raider teams are flexible enough to adapt their roles based on the specific requirements of each situation. But effective teams have developed default role distributions that align each member's particular skills with the most important functions of the team, and they can shift those roles fluidly when the situation requires it. The ability to maintain effective role coverage across changing tactical situations, to always have the right skills applied to the most critical functions at any given moment, is one of the marks of a team that has operated together for enough time to develop genuine coordination. 182. The interaction between different weapon types in a Raider team's arsenal is one of the more tactically interesting aspects of surface operation. Different weapons have different effective ranges, different rates of fire, different profiles of damage output, different noise signatures. A team that combines these characteristics effectively, that has coverage across the range of tactical situations it is likely to encounter, is more effective than a team that has duplicated the same capability multiple times. The specific weapon combinations that different Raider teams favour reflect their operational experience, the particular tactical situations they encounter most frequently, and the specific skills of their individual members. 183. The concept of fire discipline in Raider operations is probably one of the most important tactical concepts that the training system tries to instill. Fire discipline, the practice of engaging targets only when necessary, using the minimum effective fire, avoiding unnecessary suppressive fire, is directly connected to the ammunition economy that constrains all surface operations. A team that maintains fire discipline throughout a mission arrives at the end of it with more operational capacity than one that does not. In a tactical situation that deteriorates toward the end of a mission, that additional capacity may be the difference between a successful extraction and a mission failure. 184. The experience of combat on the surface against Ark machines is qualitatively different from combat training in the underground, in ways that training designers are always trying to close but never fully can. The specific combination of the surface environment, the actual presence of machines, whose behavior is more complex and less predictable than training simulations can fully capture, the genuine stakes of the encounter, and the physical and psychological state of Raiders, who have already been on the surface for some time before the combat encounter, all create a context that is genuinely different from any training context. Raiders who have extensive training but limited actual surface exposure frequently discover this difference in their first real contacts. 185. The evolution of Raider combat doctrine over the decades of the occupation is one of the more interesting aspects of the world's history. The earliest Raiders were learning as they went, developing understanding through encounters that frequently killed them. Over time, the accumulated lessons of those encounters were captured, organized, and transmitted. Current Raiders operate with a combat doctrine that reflects generations of hard-won experience. But that doctrine is not fixed. It is continuously being tested and refined by current experience, updated when new machine behaviors or new tactical situations are encountered. The people who manage this ongoing doctrinal development, who integrate new tactical experience into the transmitted knowledge of the Raider community, are performing one of the most important knowledge management functions in the underground world. 186. The management of psychological state during extended surface engagements is one of the less discussed but critically important aspects of Raider combat performance. As an engagement extends, the physical and cognitive demands of combat degrade performance in ways that have specific tactical implications. Decision quality declines. Perceptual focus narrows. Error rates increase. Physical performance drops. Experienced raiders have learned to manage these degradation effects through specific practices, through load distribution within the team, through communication patterns that help maintain decision quality under pressure, through specific protocols for when to break contact and reset versus when to push through. The management of these human performance factors is part of what distinguishes experienced raider teams from less experienced ones. 187. The specific vulnerabilities of Ark machines that raiders have identified through extensive combat experience are among the most practically important pieces of operational knowledge in the underground communities. Understanding where and how machine units can be most effectively engaged, what their failure modes are, what types of attacks are most efficient against different machine types, is part of the accumulated tactical knowledge that has been developed over decades and that is continuously refined through current experience. The raiders who have the most current and most comprehensive knowledge of machine vulnerabilities are among the most valuable operational assets in the community. 188. The concept of mutual covering fire in raider team combat, of managing the fire disciplines of different team members to provide continuous threat suppression while maintaining ammunition conservation, is one of the more sophisticated tactical skills that teams develop together. It is not simply a matter of one person shooting while another reloads. It is a coordinated management of the team's collective fire output across the tactical situation, continuously adapting to changing threat positions and priorities. Teams that have this coordination perform noticeably better in complex combat situations than teams of equivalent individual capability without the coordination. 189. The salvage of useful materials from defeated Ark machines is one of the more tactically interesting decisions that raiders make in the field. Salvaging takes time and creates exposure. The materials recovered may be highly valuable. The decision about whether to salvage, how much to salvage, and when to move on is a contextual one that requires balancing the value of the materials against the cost of the time and exposure that salvage requires. Experienced raiders have developed good intuitions for this trade-off, knowing which machine component types are worth the salvage time and which are better left in the interest of speed and security. 190. The weapons, gear and combat systems of Ark Raiders, taken as a whole, are a coherent expression of a world and a community that has adapted to extraordinary constraints. They are the physical products of an engineering culture that has learned to do more with less, that has developed creative solutions to problems that pre-invasion engineering would have solved with resources that are no longer available. They are also, in their use, an expression of a tactical culture that has learned to substitute skill and discipline for the firepower and material advantage that pre-invasion military doctrine relied on. In this sense, the weapons and the way they are used are as much a lore statement as they are a game mechanic. Chapter 7. Hidden Lore, Environmental Storytelling, and Secrets. 191. The hidden lore of Ark Raiders is not hidden in the sense of being difficult to access. It is hidden in the sense of being visible only to those who are paying a particular kind of attention, who are engaging with the game's environment as a document rather than as an obstacle course. Once you adopt that kind of attention, the surface world becomes extraordinarily rich. Every room tells a story, every ruined building has a history, every arrangement of objects is the result of specific human decisions made in specific circumstances and then frozen by catastrophe. The skill of reading this environmental lore is one of the most rewarding skills you can develop as an Ark Raiders player. 192. The arrangement of objects within specific surface locations is one of the primary media through which environmental storytelling works in Ark Raiders. An object sitting in an unexpected location, a photograph face down on the floor, beside an open door, a collection of personal items arranged near an exit as if packed for travel that never happened. These specific arrangements are not random. They reflect specific moments, specific decisions, specific situations that were interrupted by the invasion. The story these arrangements tell is not always completely recoverable, but it is always there, and reading it is part of what makes thorough exploration of the surface world emotionally resonant in ways that feel earned rather than manufactured. 193. The specific patterns of machine damage visible in the surface ruins are a form of environmental storytelling that rewards attention from people interested in understanding the history of the invasion. Machine damage has specific characteristics that distinguish it from ordinary structural deterioration and from the damage caused by other forces. The pattern of machine-related damage across a specific area tells a story about how machine forces moved through that area during the invasion, which locations they targeted preferentially, which directions the damage came from, how the human defensive response was organized, and ultimately overwhelmed. This archaeological reading of machine damage patterns is one of the more sophisticated forms of environmental law analysis available. 194. The pre-invasion media that players can find on the surface, in whatever form it has survived, is one of the most interesting lore layers available, because it shows you the pre-invasion world from the inside rather than from the outside. Reading a pre-invasion magazine or book or piece of advertising is not simply an archaeological exercise. It is a form of time travel into the specific cultural moment that was interrupted. The concerns and assumptions and aspirations of the pre-invasion world that these materials embody tell you something about what was lost that no amount of post-invasion perspective can fully convey. 195.